Hello everybody, this is Mr. Storm. In this video we're going to talk about JavaScript variables and then we're going to talk about functions as well. So, if you've ever done any programming before, the concept of a variable shouldn't be super confusing to you. Hopefully we can get through this with a minimum amount of confusion. If you've also done any kind of algebra or any kind of higher order math, then variables will make sense to you as well. Essentially what a variable is it's a special thing that we create inside of a program that allows us to store some variables. So JavaScript variables are containers for storing data values. So we use X, Y, and Z commonly as variables, and in this video you're going to see X, Y, and Z being used often. So for example, we would create a variable by using the keyword var, and then we would say var x equals 5. Now what that means is we're creating a new variable. We're going to name it x, and then we're going to set the value of x to be equal to 5. So that means we are creating a new bucket where we can store data. We're putting some duct tape on the outside of that bucket and calling it x. And then we're taking 5 and we're putting it inside that bucket. That's all we're doing. If we create another variable and name it y and then set that value equal to 6, then we have in the x variable we have 5, in the y variable we have 6. And then we can create another variable called z, which is equal to x plus y, or 5 plus 6. So z would then become 11. So essentially, this is just a way for us to store data in our program. Now, later on, when we get into allowing our users to input information into our websites, once they put in that information, we can capture that information and put it into a variable. And that way we can use variables to do math or do all kinds of things in the program, but we don't actually have to know what's being entered. We just allow the user to enter whatever they want, and then we can do with that whatever we wish. And we'll see that a lot toward the second half of the term. So this we don't really need to worry about. So this says it's much like algebra. There's one big change. There's one big difference though. In programming, whatever's on the left side of the equal sign is always what you are putting the data into. So in this case, we're putting the data into a variable called price1. And on this side, on the right side, is the actual value of the data itself, right? It's never reversed, meaning we can't say 5 equals var price1. That wouldn't work. The compiler wouldn't know what to do with that. Our web browser would be confused. So we need to always make sure that the container is on the left and the value is on the right. Alrighty. So JavaScript variables must be identified with unique names. You cannot have multiple variables in your program with the same name. It would not work. So they all have to be unique. These unique names are called identifiers. I just call them names. You can have short names like X or Y, or you can actually write out a string or a word in order to attach a name. Now, one thing that you need to pay attention to, there are specific rules that govern how we name variables. Names can contain letters, digits, underscores, and dollar signs. Names must begin with a letter. You cannot begin with a symbol or a number. And names can also begin with so names can begin with a dollar sign and an underscore, but we're not really going to do that too much. It's always going to begin with a letter for us. Names are case sensitive, y and y, so lowercase y and uppercase y are different variables, and you can't use keywords. And if you're typing out multiple words, there cannot be spaces between the words. If you create a variable, for example, up here with total volume, if you create a variable called total volume, but there's a space between total and volume, then it's going to just think that total is your variable name, and it's not going to know what you mean by volume. Volume is going to be a word that confuses the compiler, and it's going to throw an error into your program, a bug. We don't want that. So the equal sign is an assignment operator. It's not equal to. Equal to is something different that we will talk about later. The single equal sign is an assignment operator. What that means is we take the value, or we take the container we want the stuff to go into, that goes on the left side, and then the assignment operator assigns whatever's on the right side to that container. So in this example, we have x equals x plus 5. So this is a bit tricky, but if we think about it, it makes a bit of sense. We want to store something in the container x, and we want that to be equal to whatever's already in the container x plus 5. So if x already equals 10, and then we say x equals x plus 5, then it'll just be 10 plus 5. So then x now becomes 15. So you just got to kind of work your brain through that problem. It's not too difficult, but it can be a bit squirrely for some people. Okay, so data types. There are multiple different kinds of data that we can use in JavaScript. The most often values are going to the most often data types are going to be things like strings or integers or floats, basic numbers. Now the nice thing about JavaScript is we don't have to indicate the type of data we're going to use. It basically, once we put data in there, then it goes, oh, okay, that's the kind of data you're going to use. So we can always start our variables with this var keyword, and then whatever type of data we put in there, that will change that data to, or it'll change that variable to that kind of data, which is really nice. So when we create a variable, let's say variable car name, and we don't put anything in there, then what's in here is essentially undefined data. So if we don't actually, or initialize our data is what it's called, initialize our variables, put data into our variables in the very beginning, then that variable is undefined. And the value is going to be undefined. It's going to be a null value. So to assign value to it, we need to then apply, do car name equals Volvo. Notice that here we don't have var again. If you use the var keyword, that is essentially saying you're creating a new variable. If you've already created the variable, you don't need to repeat var. You can just call the variable by its name and then change the value. Now, it's always a good practice, if you can, to initialize variables when you create them, so give them some value in the beginning, especially in JavaScript, because again, we're using this var keyword. So if we want it to be only a specific data type, we want to give it some data when we first create it. So, and we can use that document.getElementById thing, that statement that we learned last week, to actually apply the value or put the value of a variable onto the screen. So for example, that var car name equals Volvo variable that we created just a second ago, or we saw being created, we can use a document.getElementById statement to output an inner, or change the inner HTML of this paragraph element to equal whatever's inside car name. Now notice that there aren't quotes around this. If we put quotes around it, it's going to actually just put the words car name into this paragraph element. We want the value of the car name variable to go in there, so we won't put quotes around it. So that way the value of that variable gets put in there. Small distinction, but it's a huge, huge difference. Let's see. We can create multiple variables with one statement. So we can say var person equals John Doe, car name equals Volvo, price 200. And notice they don't actually have to be the same data types either. We can create multiple variables with just one line. Or we can use a comma to separate. Or we can create, var person, var car name, var price. If we want to do it that way, we can as well. Alrighty. Let's see. Here we go. This is an interesting thing. So the two main data types we're going to worry about are numbers and strings. Strings are essentially just text. And if we just put in numbers with no quotes around them, then our variable becomes an integer variable, meaning it has numbers in it, and we can do math with it, and we can do comparisons with it and all that stuff. If we do just a word, then we can't do math with a word, obviously. We'll talk about why there's a plus here in a second. We can't do math with a word. If we create a number, or if we type a number but we put quotes around it, it becomes a word version of that number, if that makes sense. It's no longer a number. It is the alphanumeric character for that number. And so we can't do math with it. We can't compare things to it. We can't say, is x greater than 5? Because x is going to be effectively 0 because there's no number stored in x. X is going to be a string. Now, with strings, you can do something called concatenation. We can concatenate strings. Essentially what that means is we add strings together. So the output of this would be John space Doe. We're just adding this John string to this space string, and then we're adding that to this Doe string. And so we can concatenate variables in that way. Now, one thing that's really important to understand, if we create a variable like this, we say x equals 5 plus 2 plus 3, then we're essentially just creating all of the value is going to become a string variable. So if we say 5, 2, and 3, it's not going to actually add these numbers together. It's going to treat them like a string, and it's going to concatenate them together. So it would be 523, not 10, which would be 5 plus 2 plus 3, right? Yeah. I don't know why I can't do simple arithmetic in my head. So make sure if you want to do math with this stuff, you want to make sure you don't have the quotes around it. The $sign, yeah, we're not going to play around with that too much. Underscore, yada, yada, yada. Let's talk about math operators. Woohoo. Okay, so let's talk about some math operators. Remember, the assignment operator, not an equal sign. The assignment operator separates the variable and the data itself, right? Now, we can use an addition operator, meaning we can add numbers together. We can use a multiplication, which is this asterisk symbol, to multiply. There's also subtraction. There's exponentiation, so you can get an exponential growth of your number using exponentiation. There's division. We can use modulus. Modulus essentially does a division operation and then returns the remainder of that operation, not the whole number of that operation, if that makes sense. So if I was to get a modulus of 4 and 2, it would return 0 because there's no remainder. Alrighty. Increment is plus, meaning if we're sitting at 4 in the variable and we want to increment that variable by 1, then it becomes 5. Increments we're going to use a lot in loops and stuff. And then we have decrement or decrement, however you pronounce it, and that will reduce it by 1. Okay, so there's some squirrely ways we can use operators. For example, if you want to add some data to a variable that already exists. So for example, if you wanted to say x equals x plus 5, the shorthand for that would actually just be x plus equals 5. That is literally the same operation as x equals x plus 5. Okay? And you can do that with any of your math operators. If you put the operator before the assignment operator, then it will basically multiply whatever follows by what's already in the variable itself. Not just multiply, but whatever the operation is. String operations, we already know how to do that. Strings and numbers, again, it's going to convert it to a string if we do that. That's not what we want. Logical operators, we're not going to talk about yet. We will get into those when we talk about comparisons. Bitwise operators, I don't need about, yeah, we don't need to talk about that. All right. There's an even longer description of the arithmetic operators in here if we want to go over it in more detail. I'm not going to go over it with you, but you can go through this and read more detail if you'd like. I think we all know how addition, subtraction, multiplication all works. Here's an even longer description of the assignment variable, or the assignment operator, which again, we've covered pretty good detail so far. And here's another description of the data types. Again, this is all more information that we've covered already. Now, there's some information in here that we haven't covered. For example, Boolean variables, which are true or false variables. We haven't really talked Booleans yet, but we will again whenever we get into conditionals. Arrays we're going to talk about in the next couple of weeks. Objects, same thing. So a lot of the stuff we actually will talk about at a later date. Let's talk about functions. Okay, so functions are essentially just groups of code, groups of statements that we want to execute whenever they're being called. So a JavaScript function is a block of code designed to perform a particular task, and that function is executed when something invokes the function or calls the function. So an example of a function would be something like this. So we have a new function called myFunction. We pass in two variables to it, and then we return the multiplication value of those two variables. That's a very, very simple function. So here's how the syntax for a function works. So a JavaScript function is defined with the keyword function. So that's the first, that is indicating to the browser that you are creating a new function. Then you need to name it. So you need to give it a name. And this follows the same naming conventions as variables. And then inside you have parameters. You can give it as many parameters as you want. Parameters are essentially just data that we're bringing into the function that we can then do something with. Now the parameters are inside the parentheses. And arguments are the values received by the function when it is invoked. So arguments come in to the parameters. Again, this is all vocabulary stuff. Inside the function, the arguments behave as local variables. So once we bring in arguments into the parameters and we use them in the function, then they're used as local variables. We're basically creating variables for this function to use. So in order to invoke the function, we can do that in a couple ways. We can either invoke a function from an event, meaning a user clicks a button or something specifically happens on the screen, something loads on the screen or whatever. We can call that using an event. We can also invoke the function by calling it specifically in our JavaScript code, or it can be invoked automatically, meaning it just invokes as soon as the page loads, and it's invoked on its own. Returning value, returning data. Notice that this function has a return keyword. That means we are going to return a specific value back to where this function was called from. So this function specifically looks like it is created to provide a multiplication operation. So up here we say var x equals my function. This is us manually calling that function. We're going to pass in the numbers 4 and 3. So then this function called my function is going to run. A is going to be 4. B is going to be 3. So we're going to return the value of 4 times 3. So var x is going to be equal to 12. That's essentially how it works. It's very simplistic, but it can be a bit complicated as we get a little bit more heavy with using functions. So you might be thinking, why are we using functions? With that operation up there, we could just say x equals 4 times 3, right? Why do we need to go through all the trouble to make this extra function that does stuff? Well, functions allow you to basically write a grouping of statements once and then reuse it over and over again. So if we want to create something like here, a Celsius calculator, then we're going to pass in whatever the number in Fahrenheit is, whatever the temperature in Fahrenheit is, and it's going to return 5 divided by 9 times Fahrenheit minus 32. That is the formula we're using for a Fahrenheit to Celsius calculator. Now, because that exists by itself as a function, we can call that over and over again and just keep passing in different values for Fahrenheit. And so we don't have to keep rewriting that same function over and over again throughout our code. So, if we just write the name of the function by itself, that doesn't actually invoke the function. That's just going to refer to the object. To Celsius with the open and close parentheses is going to call the function. So if we want to call the function, we need that open and close parentheses, even if we're not passing any parameters to our function. Functions don't necessarily have to have arguments or parameters. So if we're not passing arguments to the parameters, we don't actually need anything inside the parentheses, but we still need to pass in parentheses. We still need to put in the parentheses or it won't work. Functions used as variable values. Okay, we've seen that already. Okay, good. That's about it. Okay, so this has been quite of a long video, just going through this information from an academic standpoint. When we get into the assignment, we're actually going to see how to use this stuff functionally in a program, and I'm gonna build that assignment, that calculator assignment with you. So go ahead and take your quiz on this information, and then I will see you in the calculator assignment.